Today's betrayal isn't just discovered, it's broadcast to the world. What happens when the person you trusted most has been living a hidden life right under your nose? Tonight, a marriage shatters live on camera, secrets explode. And one choice will change everything. Four of the phone vibrated softly against the coffee table, a sound almost polite in the quiet apartment. She noticed it without really noticing, the way you register thunder far away before the storm reaches you. Outside, the city slept, unaware that something fragile was about to break. She had been sitting there for hours, knees pulled to her chest, scrolling mindlessly through videos that all felt louder than her own thoughts. The red notification appeared suddenly, bright and impossible to ignore. One message, one alert. Her thumb hovered above the screen, heart tightening for reasons she couldn't explain. She told herself it was nothing. Notifications were always nothing. Still, she clicked. The name on the screen wasn't unfamiliar, but the context was wrong, too intimate, too confident. Her breathing slowed as she read it once, then again, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something harmless. They didn't. A hollow pressure formed behind her ribs, spreading outward, filling every quiet corner she had carefully avoided. She glanced down the hallway toward the bedroom. The door was half open. Her husband slept inside, unaware, peaceful, the way people always are before truth reaches them. For years, she had learned how to read his silences, how to accept distance as maturity, how to swallow doubt and call it trust. Tonight, doubt had teeth. Her hands shook as she unlocked his phone, surprised at how easily muscle memory guided her fingers. A second notification arrived, then a third. Each one felt heavier than the last, stacking evidence she never asked for. Photos followed. Messages layered with jokes, plans, and cruelty disguised as affection. This wasn't a mistake. It was a life. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark screen, eyes wide, face pale, unrecognizable. Somewhere between anger and grief, something inside her began to fracture. She wanted to scream, to wake him, to pretend none of this existed. Instead, she opened TikTok. She didn't plan it. There was no speech prepared, no clear intention beyond needing witnesses. The red Go Live button pulsed like a warning. She pressed it anyway. The camera flipped, capturing her trembling face as viewers slowly joined. Strangers drawn by curiosity, unaware they were stepping into a private collapse. "Hi," she whispered, forcing a smile that didn't belong to her. Hearts floated up the screen. Comments followed. She stood, phone in hand, and walked toward the bedroom, each step heavier than the last. The door creaked as she pushed it open. He stirred, confused, blinking into the light. "What are you doing?" he asked, voice thick with sleep. She raised the phone, angling the screen so both he and the viewers could see. For the first time in years, he looked afraid. "This," she said quietly, "is the truth." As the live audience grew, so did the weight of what she was about to unleash. She didn't know yet how the night would end, only that something irreversible had begun. The room felt smaller with every second, air thick with unspoken history and digital eyes watching. Somewhere deep inside, she sensed that truth, once exposed, never chooses its victims fairly and never stops once released. Justice would come eventually. But already, in that moment, it was clear it wouldn't come for the one who paid the highest price online. Morning arrived quietly, as if the night had never happened. The apartment smelled of cold coffee and charged air. She sat at the kitchen table, phone face down, while her husband moved around behind her, pretending normalcy was still possible. Neither spoke. Silence had always been their shared language, refined over years of avoidance. They hadn't started this way. Once, their marriage was loud with plans, laughter, and promises spoken too quickly. He admired her composure, her patience. She admired his confidence, the way he filled rooms without trying. But admiration slowly turned into expectation, and expectation hardened into routine. They learned when not to ask questions. They learned how to coexist without touching truth. He worked late often, explaining absences with tired smiles and vague excuses. She responded with nods and reheated dinners, telling herself independence was strength. Arguments were rare, not because they agreed, but because silence was easier than confrontation. Every unspoken doubt became another brick in the wall between them. She remembered the first time she felt invisible. A dinner forgotten, a message unanswered. Small moments dismissed until they formed a pattern too familiar to ignore. When she tried to speak, he listened just enough to seem present, then redirected the conversation back to himself. Over time, her voice softened. Eventually, it disappeared. To the outside world, they were stable, successful, enviable. Online, they smiled in photos, captions filled with inside jokes no longer shared. Friends praised their calm, their maturity. No one noticed how her laughter never reached her eyes anymore, or how his phone was always face down. That silence wasn't peaceful, it was strategic. He used it to control narratives, to rewrite history when necessary. If she questioned him, he called her insecure. If she pressed further, he withdrew completely, leaving her to apologize for problems she couldn't name. Gaslighting didn't arrive loudly. It settled in quietly like dust. The night before replayed in fragments. His startled face, the fear that flashed too late. For years, she had blamed herself for the distance, for the loneliness that followed her even when he was beside her. Now she understood silence had protected him, not them. She watched him carefully now, noticing details she once ignored. The controlled calm, the rehearsed disappointment, the way he positioned himself as reasonable while quietly assigning blame. This was how he had always won arguments without raising his voice. Silence, she understood, had been his shield and his weapon. It allowed him to keep secrets intact, to live parallel lives without resistance. Every pause, every unanswered question had been permission he never deserved. She thought of the years she spent shrinking, editing herself to keep the peace. Of nights spent awake, convincing herself loneliness was normal inside marriage. Those sacrifices had gone unnoticed, unrecorded, invisible. But the internet remembered everything. And now, as notifications continued to multiply, the silence that once protected him was becoming evidence. The wall they built together was collapsing, and she sensed that once the truth spoke aloud, it would demand consequences far beyond apologies, far beyond law, far beyond anything either of them could control or escape from entirely now. Across the table, he finally spoke. "We shouldn't have done that," he said, gesturing vaguely, refusing to look at her. Not an apology, not a denial, just control slipping through his fingers. Her phone vibrated again. She didn't need to look to know what it was. Somewhere, the silence they built together was cracking open, piece by piece. And as the quiet finally broke, she realized justice would come in its own way. But it wouldn't come for the one who had suffered most behind closed doors. The silence didn't return after that morning. It followed her instead, clinging as she moved through the apartment, growing heavier with every unanswered vibration of her phone. She finally looked. The live replay was everywhere now, clipped, slowed, dissected by strangers who thought they understood what they had witnessed. But what haunted her wasn't the audience. It was how calm he had been once the camera turned off. She began searching with a precision born of exhaustion, not rage, not hysteria, but focus. Emails first, archived folders, forgotten apps. Every login felt like trespassing into a version of her marriage she had never been invited to enter. Each discovery rewrote memories she once trusted. Late meetings became rehearsed alibis. Business trips became coordinates. Silence became strategy. There were accounts under different names, profiles built carefully over years. He spoke differently there, softer, crueler, freer. The man she married believed in boundaries. This man thrived without them. Messages revealed routines, rituals, jokes repeated like lines from a script. He wasn't hiding anymore. He had perfected concealment. The affair wasn't just emotional, it wasn't even just physical. It was layered, organized, shared with others who knew exactly who she was and chose to ignore her existence. In some messages, she appeared as a punchline. In others, as an obstacle. Once as a threat. Reading them felt like watching herself erased in real time. She sat on the floor beside the couch as hours passed, phone glowing, hands numb. There were photos she couldn't unsee, audio notes recorded in a voice she barely recognized, promises made with confidence that belonged to someone else's future. He had plans. He had timelines. He had an exit that didn't include honesty. What disturbed her most wasn't the betrayal. It was the ease. He compartmentalized his lives effortlessly, switching roles without guilt. Husband, lover. Victim, each mask fit perfectly. The silence she once thought protected their marriage had actually protected his freedom. Every time she chose not to ask, he chose to go further. She replayed conversations from years past, noticing pauses where truths had been swallowed. Moments when he redirected affection, weaponized calm, or manufactured conflict to justify distance. This wasn't a collapse, it was architecture, carefully designed, patiently maintained. By the time evening returned, she realized this wasn't an affair hidden in shadows. It was a parallel existence lived openly among people who validated it. She wasn't betrayed by one person. She was excluded by many. and the world was only now beginning to see fragments of it. Her phone vibrated again, not with comments, but with a message from him. Simple, controlled. "We need to talk." No panic, no regret, just management. She thought about the people behind those screens, the ones who encouraged him, protected him, normalized cruelty as connection. None of them would lose sleep tonight. None would answer questions later. They would vanish, usernames deleted, memories rewritten. Only she would remain, carrying proof that could never be fully explained without sounding unhinged. The truth was heavier than lies because it demanded witnesses, consequences, endurance. And as she prepared herself for the next confrontation, she understood that revealing the other life he lived would not free her. It would only pull her deeper into a story where silence was gone, but mercy was never promised. The next step would force her to choose exposure over survival again. She looked around the apartment, at photos still on the walls, at a life staged for appearances. Everything felt borrowed now. Somewhere between the lies and the truth, something irreversible had shifted. She understood then that exposing him wouldn't dismantle the structure he built. It would only change who paid for it. Justice would arrive eventually, wrapped in rules and process. But the highest cost had already been claimed quietly, long before anyone decided who deserved punishment.
The truth didn't explode, it crept. After uncovering the other life he lived, she didn't confront him immediately, she watched instead. Observation felt safer than emotion. If love had once made her blind, knowledge made her precise. Every movement, every pause, every glance became data she quietly collected. She memorized his patterns, the exact second he checked his phone after waking, the way his posture shifted when a certain name appeared, how his tone softened when he stepped outside to take calls he claimed were work-related. She stopped asking questions and started recording answers he didn't realize he was giving. Her days turned methodical, screenshots saved to hidden folders, timelines drawn in her head. She learned how long lies took to form, how easily truth could be reshaped when delivered calmly. Surveillance replaced intimacy. Watching him felt intimate in a way their marriage no longer was. At least observation didn't lie. At night, while he slept, she replayed conversations through headphones, listening for cracks in rehearsed sincerity. She noticed how often he spoke in half-truths, how rarely he used names, how confidently he assumed control of every narrative. The more she watched, the clearer it became that she had never truly known him. She had known the version designed for her. This wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. She wasn't searching for justification anymore. She was documenting reality. Every saved file felt like reclaiming something stolen, time, dignity, voice. Still, the weight of it pressed against her chest, heavy and constant. Surveillance demanded endurance. Sometimes she caught her reflection in dark screens and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes were sharper now, her expressions controlled. She had become someone who waited, someone who studied silence instead of fearing it. Love hadn't turned violent yet. It had turned cold. He noticed the change but misread it completely. He mistook her quiet for acceptance, her distance for recovery. He moved more freely, careless with routines he once guarded carefully. Confidence made him sloppy. Control always does. The more he believed he had won, the more visible his other life became. One evening, she followed him without planning to. He said he was meeting friends. She stayed several steps behind, heart steady, breath even. Watching him enter a place he had once sworn he hated felt like confirmation, not shock. This wasn't discovery, it was proof. She didn't go inside. She didn't need to. What mattered was knowing she could, that she was no longer trapped by doubt. Surveillance gave her power, but it also demanded a cost. Watching someone you love betray you repeatedly hollows something essential. It teaches patience the wrong way and sharpens instincts meant for survival, not partnership. The drive home felt unreal. Streetlights blurred past the windshield as her mind replayed years of dismissed instincts. She realized she had been trained to doubt herself while trusting someone who benefited from that doubt. Surveillance hadn't created her suspicion. It had confirmed it. By the time she returned home, she understood the truth fully. Love hadn't protected her, trust hadn't saved her, only awareness remained, and awareness was dangerous. It asked for decisions, not forgiveness. She opened her phone, scrolling past messages, past comments, past the noise of strangers. She knew what came next would change everything. Surveillance had given her certainty, and certainty demanded action. She felt the quiet before storms, the pause before impact, knowing whatever she chose next would no longer belong solely to her, but to everyone already watching her closely. Justice would arrive eventually, filtered through institutions and distance, but the highest price was already being paid privately, minute by minute, by the one who watched everything and was still expected to stay silent. Certainty stripped away her last excuse for mercy. After surveillance came identification. The affair was no longer abstract, no longer a shadow hiding behind notifications and usernames. It had a face now, and that face stared back at her from the screen with unsettling familiarity. She found it by accident, or maybe inevitability, a tagged photo, a careless comment, a digital breadcrumb left behind by confidence. The profile loaded slowly, each second stretching tight across her nerves. When the image appeared, her stomach dropped, not from surprise, but recognition. This wasn't a stranger from a distant world. This was someone who had brushed past her life without hesitation. The woman smiled brightly in every photo, curated and fearless, living openly in a space where secrets didn't suffocate. Captions spoke of freedom, honesty, connection. The hypocrisy stung more than cruelty. She scrolled deeper, tracing patterns of timing, shared locations, overlapping absences. Their worlds had intersected countless times while she remained invisible by design. Messages revealed an intimacy that felt rehearsed, almost professional. They didn't just share desire, they shared strategy. The affair partner knew about her, knew when to avoid questions, knew when silence was useful. This wasn't ignorance, it was cooperation. She wasn't betrayed by accident. She was bypassed intentionally. What hurt most was discovering fragments of herself repackaged and mocked. Personal stories retold for entertainment, vulnerabilities repurposed as jokes. Moments she thought were private had become material for bonding. Her pain had been currency. Reading it felt like being dissected while still breathing. The affair partner wasn't cruel in obvious ways. That was the worst part. There were no threats, no insults, just indifference sharpened into efficiency. She had been reduced to an inconvenience in someone else's love story, a problem to be managed, not a person to be acknowledged. She closed her eyes and remembered casual encounters, polite smiles exchanged without suspicion. The realization sickened her. Betrayal didn't always arrive violently. Sometimes it blended into normalcy, wearing friendliness like camouflage. For a moment, rage surged hot and sudden, but it passed quickly, replaced by something colder. Understanding this wasn't about passion, it was about power. Two people bonding over shared secrecy, feeding off imbalance, convinced that control meant immunity. They believed exposure was impossible because silence had always worked before. Her phone vibrated with another message from him, still calm, still managerial. "We can fix this," it read. The audacity made her laugh softly, a sound that startled her with its emptiness. Fixing required consent. What they had built relied on erasure. She realized then that confrontation wouldn't come quietly. The face behind the screen had clarified everything. This wasn't a private betrayal to be resolved behind closed doors. It was a performance sustained by audiences, secrecy, and silence. And silence was no longer an option she could afford. As night settled in, she sat alone, phone glowing, mind clear in a way it hadn't been for years. She knew the next step would bring attention she couldn't control. Consequences she couldn't predict, but she also knew retreat would destroy her more slowly. The affair partner would vanish when exposed. He would explain, minimize, survive. Systems would protect them both in familiar ways, and she would be left holding truth heavy enough to break bones. Justice would arrive eventually, wrapped in distance and procedure. But the one who had paid the highest price already understood something no verdict could correct. Some losses are permanent long before the world decides who deserves blame.
The decision didn't arrive with courage. It arrived with exhaustion. After seeing the face behind the screen, retreat felt like slow erasure. She set her phone on the counter, palms flat, breathing through the tremor in her chest. Exposure wasn't revenge. It was refusal. Refusal to disappear quietly while others edited her life into a joke. She opened TikTok and watched familiar faces dance, sell, confess. Normality scrolled past like a taunt. Her thumb hovered. The red button pulsed, patient and unforgiving. She thought about the years of silence, the proof archived, the messages that would never apologize. Then she pressed go live. The camera flipped. Her face filled the frame, unfiltered, eyes steady in a way she didn't feel. A few viewers joined, then more. Hearts floated upward like misplaced comfort. "Hi," she said, voice thin but controlled. "I'm doing this because I'm done being quiet." She didn't name him yet. She needed witnesses first. She walked toward the bedroom. Each step felt ceremonial, measured, irreversible. The door opened. Light cut across the sheets. He stirred, confused, then alert when he saw the phone. "What is this?" he asked, sitting up, irritation masked as concern. She angled the screen so the comments were visible. The audience doubled. She spoke carefully, narrating facts, not feelings, dates, messages, lies. She read his words aloud, letting them breathe in public air. He laughed once, incredulous, then tried charm. "You're overreacting," he said, glancing at the screen, calculating. The comments turned sharp. Screenshots appeared from strangers recording everything. Controls slipped. His voice hardened. "Turn it off," he said, reaching for the phone. She stepped back. "No," she replied, steady now. "You don't get silence anymore." The room tightened with attention. Thousands watched two lives collide without rehearsal. He confessed without meaning to. Minimizing, justifying, admitting patterns he assumed sounded reasonable. Each sentence became evidence. Each shrug translated as guilt. The chat exploded. She felt oddly distant, like a narrator trapped inside her body, describing a storm she could no longer stop. Time warped. Notifications screamed. A moderator tried to warn her, then vanished under the flood. Someone typed an address. Someone else begged her to stop. He paced, bargaining, promising therapy, transparency, anything that sounded salvageable. She listened without absorbing, aware only of the camera's unblinking eye and the heat rising behind her eyes. The room smelled metallic, electric. Her grip tightened, then steadied. She framed the shot deliberately, refusing chaos. In that pause, she felt an old training surface. Stay calm, stay clear, stay audible. The internet wanted spectacle. She chose testimony. The counter climbed again, numbers blurring into responsibility. Whatever followed would be owned, recorded, replayed. Silence had ended, permanence had begun. Her breath slowed as comments raced, and she knew restraint itself could provoke consequences as severe as any reckless act chosen publicly by strangers watching. She understood in that suspended second that justice would eventually arrive, formal and selective, but it wouldn't protect the one who had already paid the highest price for telling the truth out loud.
The live stream didn't slow after her last words. It accelerated. Comments stacked faster than she could read, accusations and encouragement colliding into noise. He noticed the shift immediately. The audience was no longer curious. It was judging. He sat down hard, elbows on knees, eyes flicking between her and the phone like exits closing. "Listen," he said, forcing a smile that once worked on everyone. "This isn't what it looks like." He spoke carefully, shaping sentences for strangers instead of her. She said nothing, letting the silence stretch until he filled it himself. Silence had always made him talk. He began with denial, then pivoted to explanation. Stress, distance, misunderstandings. He framed betrayal as circumstance, intimacy as accident. Each rationalization unraveled under its own weight. The chat called him out line by line. He corrected himself, then overcorrected, revealing details he hadn't planned to share. Yes, it went on for a while. he admitted, waving a hand. But it wasn't serious. He paused, recalculating. Okay, sometimes it was. The room felt smaller as truth leaked through gaps he couldn't seal. She kept the camera steady, narrating timestamps, reading messages aloud. His words echoed back at him, stripped of charm. He tried anger next. "You're humiliating me," he snapped. The audience responded instantly. Clips circulated. Someone identified the affair partner. Another posted dates. He swore under his breath, realizing the past was being reconstructed without his consent. Control collapsed in increments. Pressed by the flood, he confessed more. He talked about burner phones, shared calendars, rules they followed to avoid suspicion. He laughed nervously while describing logistics, then stopped when the chat turned cold. The laughter had sounded wrong even to him. He swallowed and continued. Compelled by momentum, he no longer directed. What he didn't expect was how easily words betrayed him. He admitted knowing she suspected, admitted exploiting her patience, admitted he chose silence because it worked. Each admission landed heavier than the last. The truth wasn't dramatic. It was methodical, efficient, devastating. She finally spoke, voice calm. "Did you ever plan to tell me?" The question cut through the noise. He hesitated. That hesitation became the loudest confession of all. "No," he said, too late to soften it. The chat exploded. Something shifted then. Fear replaced calculation. He tried to backpedal, to apologize broadly, to promise therapy, transparency, anything. The words sounded borrowed. She watched him unravel with a detachment that surprised her. Confession didn't bring relief. It exposed intent. Viewers begged her to stop. Others demanded she continue. Authority warnings flashed briefly and vanished. The room felt unreal, like a stage without curtains. He reached for her wrist, pleading off camera. She stepped back, keeping the frame clean. The audience saw everything. He spoke again, quieter now, and crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He admitted to acts that weren't just immoral, but illegal. The chat froze, then erupted. Screens recorded, sirens became possible, consequences crystallized, her breath shortened, the weight of responsibility pressed in. Confession had transformed into evidence. She realized nothing she did next could restore balance. Exposure had teeth, and it demanded payment. She felt the room tilt as the implications spread beyond the screen. Laws, headlines, families, employers, all rushing closer. This wasn't catharsis, it was ignition. The truth had escaped containment and begun choosing its own path. She sensed the shift from confession to catastrophe, from story to case. Every viewer became a witness, every replay a permanent scar. The stream continued, unstoppable, dragging her forward while offering no protection at all. She knew institutions would move slower than outrage, and consequences would land unevenly, punishing visibility instead of deception later on. She steadied the phone, eyes shining, and understood justice would come eventually, selective and procedural, but it would never compensate the one who had already paid the highest price in public truth. When the confession crossed into legality, the room changed temperature. Her hands tingled, numb then burning, as if nerves were shorting out. The chat scrolled faster, warnings layered over cheers, authority notices blinking and disappearing. He kept talking, trying to soften damage already done, but his voice thinned into noise. She felt herself drifting a step behind her body, watching someone else hold the phone. She tried to ground herself in details. The hum of the refrigerator, the smudge on the mirror, the pulse in her throat. Years of swallowed questions crowded forward, demanding space all at once. She hadn't planned this part. Exposure had been a line she could cross. Consequences were a tide she hadn't measured. He moved closer, palms open, a familiar posture meant to soothe. "Please," he said, eyes flicking to the screen, to the comments that now carried addresses and names. "We can end this. End it." As if endings were switches he controlled. as if silence could be restored like furniture returned to place. She shook her head. Words failed. Her chest tightened, breaths turning shallow. The audience felt enormous, an invisible mass pressing inward. Some begged her to stop. Others demanded she continue, as if her pain were a vote. The weight of watching cracked something essential. Privacy had evaporated. Choice followed. He reached again. She stepped back and bumped the counter. The phone jolted, the frame skewed, catching the edge of the room and the shadow under the cabinets. Her vision tunneled. Images overlapped, years of waiting, nights rehearsing conversations that never happened, the messages that laughed at her. The sound in her ears roared. "I can explain." He insisted, louder now, anger threading fear. He talked about mistakes, about love as scarcity, about entitlement dressed as honesty. Each word scraped. She wanted quiet more than justice, relief more than truth. The stream denied both. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She set the phone down to steady herself. The chat surged, alarms and hearts colliding. Someone typed her name, another typed his. The world felt too close. She felt the break before she understood it. Not a snap, but a collapse, like a support removed quietly. Tears came without sound. Then laughter, brief and hollow, startled even her. She pressed her palms to her eyes and breathed, counting, failing to slow the spiral. Behind her, something clinked softly as her elbow brushed the counter. The sound cut through the noise, sharp and specific. She froze, her gaze dropped, then lifted, tracking the edge of the frame. The audience couldn't see it yet. He could. His face changed. "Don't," he said, finally afraid, voice small. He took a step back, then another, recalculating. The room held its breath. The phone kept recording. She lifted her head and met her reflection in the dark screen. She saw the woman she had been, and the one she had become in the same glance. Control was gone. So was silence. What remained was a choice no one could take from her, even now. Outside, sirens seemed possible, imagined or real, folding into her thoughts. She pictured headlines assembling themselves, clips looping, faces frozen into judgments. She pictured families waking to notifications, lawyers drafting careful statements, platforms issuing warnings. None of that mattered in the room. What mattered was the weight in her arms, the gaze of a man unmoored, and the knowledge that stopping now would not undo what had already been released. Time narrowed brutally, compressing past, present, and future into a single, irreversible moment of choice alone. She reached just out of frame, not thinking about permanence, only about ending the noise. In that suspended second, with thousands watching, she understood justice would come eventually, formal and late, but never for the one who had already paid the highest price. The room felt impossibly small. The phone trembled in her hands, catching every flicker of movement, every gasp, every shadow across the floor. Outside the frame, the city continued its unaware rhythm. Inside, time slowed to inches. The air tasted metallic, thick, heavy. Her pulse slammed in her ears. Every heartbeat felt like a verdict already delivered. He was still scrambling for control, muttering promises he no longer believed. It's not what it looks like." His voice cracked, faltering under the pressure of thousands of unseen witnesses. He gestured wildly, trying to block the camera, but she kept it steady, frame unbroken. The audience multiplied by the second. Notifications exploded into a flood she couldn't stop. The first sharp sound came, glass cracking, then a thud, loud, definite. The camera wobbled, caught the angle as he stumbled backward, tripping over furniture he once knew by rote. His face twisted with disbelief. Panic replaced arrogance. He reached toward her, voice shaking, begging for calm, but it was too late. The moment had passed the point of argument, rationalization, negotiation. She moved like a ghost, not in haste, not in malice, but in inevitability. Her hands shook, but her focus never wavered. Viewers commented, screamed, some pleading for her to stop, others applauding, some recording for later. She ignored them. All that existed was him, the space between them, and the evidence being etched into digital eternity. The first impact echoed, final, irrevocable. The camera caught it all, the sway of his body, the shock in his eyes, the disbelief frozen on his face. The sounds, though muted for some devices, felt like explosions in the room. She felt nothing for a second, as if watching someone else. Then the weight hit her, gravity folding inward, making every breath a labor. Outside the room, sirens approached, distant and uncertain at first, then closer, inevitable. The live comments became chaos, viewers shouting, warning, debating, crying. Someone typed, "Call 911, another, "She's done it, she actually did it." The screen captured it all. Every word became part of the record, every gaze a witness to the irreversibility of the act. He collapsed against the floor, silent now, except for shallow, ragged breathing. She stood, phone still recording, staring at the body she once loved and knew, now impossible to reconcile with the truth of years of betrayal. The room smelled sharply of metal and fear. Shadows from the low lamp danced across walls lined with memories now irrelevant, fractured. For a moment, the world paused. She thought of all the nights she had silenced herself, all the messages ignored, all the small betrayals stitched quietly into their marriage. None of that mattered. Only this moment was real. Only the frame of the phone, steady in her hands, mattered. Her chest tightened. She realized that justice, when it arrived, would arrive selectively. Authorities would review footage. News channels would dissect angles. Experts would speculate. Social media would replay, dissect, and hashtag, but none of it would undo the personal toll she had carried for years. None of it would restore the years stolen by lies, the nights spent doubting herself, the moments when her voice was deliberately silenced. The sirens grew louder, now unmistakable, and she finally dropped the phone, letting it record the final frame on the floor. The act was over, but the consequences were only beginning. She knew what was coming next: interrogation, cameras, lawyers, media. But in that suspended second, she also knew that her own suffering, the years of quiet pain, emotional erosion, and meticulous documentation of betrayal, would remain invisible to most. Justice would arrive eventually, slow and deliberate, but it would never reach the one who had paid the highest price, the one who had carried truth like a burning stone, who had gone live for witnesses, who had endured everything in silence before the world watched. The cost had already been claimed, and the room, now empty except for shadows and evidence, carried the echo of that truth. The aftermath arrived before the authorities, like a wave that preceded the tide. The video had spread faster than she could track, clipped and reposted, slowed down, analyzed, debated. Millions had witnessed the act. Opinions poured in from strangers who had never met her, never met him, yet felt entitled to verdicts. The internet had transformed from observer to jury, prosecutor, and historian all at once. Police arrived finally, cautious, procedural, their footsteps echoing through the apartment like a drumbeat of inevitability. She met them quietly, hands raised, voice steady despite the chaos around her. Statements were taken, evidence catalogued, screenshots, phone records, timestamps, all immutable. The room that had held intimate betrayal and sudden violence now smelled of antiseptic and official restraint. News outlets picked it up immediately. Headlines competed for shock value. Husband murdered live on TikTok. Digital witnesses watch a marriage collapse. Streaming tragedy or justice. Interviews with neighbors, friends, and analysts proliferated, each claiming insight. Public opinion splintered instantly. Some called her a victim of years of deception. Others labeled her a criminal. Rarely did anyone consider the toll of exposure, the cost of bearing truth while the world watched. Lawyers and prosecutors arrived next, calculating angles, framing intent, piecing together the facts against a backdrop of a global audience. Legal debates raged online simultaneously, with clips circulating faster than the law could respond. Every gesture, every expression recorded, dissected, turned into argument. She realized the court of screens might be harsher than any courtroom she would face. Meanwhile, she was left with quiet moments in the holding room. Phones were confiscated, comments disappeared, notifications ceased. For the first time in years, silence returned. But it was different now, heavy, suffocating, charged with a permanence that could not be undone. She thought about all the hours spent watching, documenting, calculating. Years of betrayal, meticulous evidence, her endurance, all had led to this. And yet, the recognition that the formal systems would only partially honor that endurance gnawed at her. Outside, social media moved on even faster. Memes formed, opinions hardened, new scandals overtook old ones. The digital crowd dispersed, leaving only fragments of memory behind. Only she remembered fully, only she carried the depth of every wrong she had endured, the constant betrayal, the quiet observation that had prepared her for the moment the world saw her husband's truths. She reflected on what justice could mean in this age of screens. The law would act eventually, selectively, assessing murder, intent, evidence, but it could never grasp the psychological years of manipulation, the isolation, the surveillance she had practiced to survive. She understood now that truth had a price, and the scales of formal justice were never designed to measure it fully. Her thoughts returned to him, to the man who had hidden lives behind screens, who had played with her patience and confidence. He would be remembered in headlines, prosecuted in court, debated endlessly. But the woman who had lived the betrayal, who had carried knowledge for years, whose every action had been calculated and deliberate, would never receive recompense. Not from law, not from public opinion, not from the screens that had documented her suffering as spectacle. She sat back, letting the sterile air fill her lungs, realizing that some costs were private. Some truths were paid for in ways no court could acknowledge, no algorithm could quantify. Justice might arrive, slow, impersonal, and selective, but the one who had paid the highest price would remain unseen, unacknowledged, and unprotected, long after the world had moved on. The room felt smaller still, heavier, as she understood that even in the age of screens, exposure did not equal relief, and witnesses did not equal justice. She had survived the live, survived the confession, survived the act, but survival did not equal vindication. And justice, formal and delayed, would arrive, just not for her. The prison walls were cold, gray, and unyielding, a far cry from the apartment that had once been both her sanctuary and her stage. She walked slowly down the corridor, hands folded, footsteps echoing hollowly. The world outside had moved on in fragments. Clips replayed endlessly, hashtags faded, headlines replaced. But she carried the memory of every second, every image, every confession. Truth had a cost, and it had been paid fully, privately, and alone. Her cell was small, sterile, and suffocating, yet it provided a strange clarity. Here, no comments scrolled, no cameras recorded, no audience demanded explanation. She could finally reflect without interruption, but reflection was heavy. Years of betrayal, deception, surveillance, and calculated exposure had built a life lived mostly in shadow. Every action, every observation, every restraint had led to that final, irreversible act. She thought of him, the man she had loved and known only partially. He had hidden lives, carefully constructed narratives, and facades so convincing that even intimacy had felt like theater. He had believed silence could protect him, that deception could be endless, that she would remain ignorant indefinitely. She had learned the opposite. Truth had endurance, and when released, it demanded reckoning. Memories pressed in, the red notifications, the messages, the hidden profiles, the careful tracking, the final live stream. Each moment had escalated, compounded, and coalesced into the night that would be remembered digitally forever. She had orchestrated exposure with the precision of someone who had lived years waiting for a moment to strike. But no preparation could erase the emotional toll. The act had freed her from ignorance, but chained her to consequences she could not escape. She remembered the audience, thousands of strangers, eyes unblinking, hearts and comments racing, witnessing her unraveling, witnessing his confessions. They had seen the culmination, but not the preparation, the slow buildup of betrayal and observation that had preceded the final act. They had seen performance, not endurance. They had applauded or condemned without knowing the subtleties of the years behind the single, climactic moment. Letters arrived slowly, some from families outraged, others offering sympathy, but none truly understood. No institution could quantify the quiet suffering, the constant vigilance, the strategic patience, the psychological erosion that had preceded exposure. She realized then that truth, once revealed, exacted its payment unevenly. Some faced legal judgment, others public scorn, but only she had paid in every possible dimension: emotion, patience, calculation, and humanity itself. Her thoughts wandered to the concept of justice. Courts would convene, evidence would be presented, verdicts delivered, punishments assigned. But justice measured only what could be quantified, what could be proven in law. It could never account for the emotional labor she had performed, the years of silent suffering, the careful cataloging of betrayal, the long nights spent observing him to prepare for a moment that no one else would ever fully comprehend. And yet, despite it all, she did not regret the act. Truth demanded exposure. Silence would have destroyed her entirely. The moment she went live, the moment she let evidence speak, she had reclaimed a fragment of agency stolen over years. But the reclamation came at a cost visible only to her: the loss of innocence, the shattering of peace, the permanent alteration of identity. She sat on the edge of the narrow cot, staring at the walls, and understood fully. Justice would come eventually, delayed, calculated, measured by society's standards. But the one who had already paid the highest price, the one who bore the total weight of truth, action, and consequence, would never see restitution, acknowledgement, or relief. Some prices are too heavy, some debts unpayable. She had learned, painfully and irrevocably, that exposure does not equal relief, that witnesses do not equal vindication, and that justice, in the end, arrives only partially, always imperfect, and never for the one who has already suffered most. The cell was silent except for the hum of the ventilation. She closed her eyes, accepting that the world outside would move on, that headlines would fade, and that stories would be told without her perspective. Yet within her the cost remained indelible, eternal, and complete. Justice would come, but not for the one who paid the highest price.